Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today is a video that I have very long been anticipating already for a few months. And the way it came to be is that I am in a Discord, and the Discord is the Discord of M.A. Carrick, Marie Brennan and Alice Helms, who are the authors of my favorite series of all time, the Rook and Rose series. And so a few months ago, leading up to the release of Labyrinth's Heart, the third book in the series, they were kind of talking about doing interviews on channels and YouTube and podcasts and so on. And so I decided to shoot my shot and to invite them onto my channel and ask them if they wanted to talk about, well, mostly world building, to be honest, because as you all know, I study anthropology, and both Alice Helms as well as Marie Brennan have a background in anthropology, so that was something that I was very excited to talk about. And they graciously said yes, so this is the video that you're now seeing, and I hope you enjoy it. So we're live now, and I am joined by Marie Brennan and Alice Helms, aka M.A. Carrick, who are the authors of the series that I have been hyping for 2-ish years now, I think, 2.5 years. I think 2021 was the first one, right?
Yeah, right at the beginning.
So, yeah, why don't you introduce yourselves first?
I am Marie Brennan. I am generally best known as the author of the Memoirs of Lady Trent, which are the life story of a woman in a kind of Victorian setting who basically wants to be a field biologist for dragons, as well as short stories, some game writing. I've started writing poetry recently, which has not ceased to confuse me yet, but had my first poem published recently, so all kinds of things.
And then I am Alice Helms. I am the author of The Adventures of Mr. Mystic, which are kind of a noir Shansha mashup, which is an interesting collision of genres. And also a few short stories in game fiction, but then obviously the other half of M.A. Carrick.
Speaking of M.A. Carrick and the Rook and Rose series, which obviously is 3 books, the last book, Labyrinth's Heart, just recently came out 2-ish weeks ago.
Almost 2 exactly.
Yeah. The first was Mask of Mirrors, second, The Liar's Knot. I have summed that series up plenty of times on my channel. You probably have also summed it up plenty of times. Can I ask you anyway to maybe have a different version from what I usually do?
I usually try to cheese out by just quoting The Princess Bride, when the kid asks if there are any sports in the book, and the grandfather says, "Are you kidding? Fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, miracles." We only have like a reference to a giant. It's a little bit, less accurate, but a lot of swashbuckling fun and political intrigue, and a con artist trying to worm her way into a noble house while running afoul of a vigilante who does not like the nobility.
It's a pretty good summary. I always try. It's a problem with series that I particularly love. I try to go into way too much detail.
It's hard to sum this one up well, yeah.
There's the little intro we have, which is a con artist just trying to con her way into a noble family and runs into shenanigans. But it becomes so much more than that, because it's about, the relationships that she creates between her marks and the kind of complications you get there when you start to care about people that you were in a questionable relationship with. And it's about found family. It's about this whole kind of city environment we have with the collision between different cultures and this kind of occupier culture and indigenous culture. And so there's the quick entry, but then it blossoms out into a much bigger kind of.
And by bigger, we mean bigger.
Bigger.
They are thick books. There is a lot of different flavors of thing going on in there.
So much flavor, but honestly, I appreciate the length because I don't know, maybe that's just my impression, but with fantasy books that have been published like in the last 10 years or so, more and more are under the 500-page mark. And this series just really needs the space because it's just so rich in everything. And maybe because, Alice, you were already mentioning the whole occupier and indigenous population, which, I mean, I've already said so a little bit in my emails to you that, and I've mentioned it plenty of times also on my channel, the world building really is one of my favorite parts of the series because there's so many elements to it. But obviously the central stage of Nadezhda as the series that has been occupied for 200 years and has been colonized and has so many different cultures, it's not just a lot of elements to juggle, but it's also kind of, was it like a, how do I say it? My English is leaving me right now, but like a thin line to walk to where you could capture all the nuances of what the situation means for the people living there, and yet not make it too much for what a story could offer. Like how did you go about that?
There definitely are places where we did have to simplify a little bit because, like, we could have put in more detail on a lot of those things. We could have put in more nuance and made it more complex, and the book would have been 9,000 pages long, and our pacing would have gone to hell in a handbasket. And so, it's going to differ from reader to reader whether they think we made those simplifications in the right place, but we had to make some choices, or else, have there be other parts of the story that we just weren't even going to do, and we didn't want to just toss any of them out wholesale. So
And I think the places where we tended to focus on, and the places we tended to cut out, have a lot to do with character, because this gets into what we talk about as our anthropological style of disseminating our world building, which is you're getting everything through the lens of the character you're in. And so it's going to be, they're focused on things that are important to them and the things that they notice and the discomforts that they noticed. And so it's really fun because we do have multiple perspectives, and so we get into somebody like Danaya's perspective, who is the noble woman that Ren is conning, and she's got all sorts of uh, uh, things that she is not aware of, that are pain points for Ren and for the other people who are part of this indigenous uh, peoples that live in Nadeshra. But Denaya doesn't see those. She has other kind of her own discomforts and pain points and her feelings about the original kind of country that her colonizing people came from, and her feelings like, she has to kind of justify, her nobility to those people because they sit in a higher regard for her because of the relationship between her people and that country that they come from. And so then you get her perspective, then you get Ren's perspective on that's those same kinds of relationships, and the way that Ren is using them and playing them and toying with, Denaya's sense of self-consciousness. But then you also get things like, this family that Ren is conning is, by nobility standards, impoverished. Like, they're having a lot of difficulty, they're struggling, they're falling on hard times. But then from Ren's perspective, she's like, this is not poverty, people. This is definitely, you are fine compared to how I grew up. And so it's really fun getting to portray those differences of, perspective, depending on the character you're inhabiting. And in a lot of cases, the choices we made about, the history and the things that we were focusing on and the pain points came down to whose perspective and what was important to them.
with the way that we bring the information in, we probably could have done more if we were a little more willing to just stop and like give a block of exposition to the reader. But we both really like stories where it just gets salted in one detail at a time and you kind of figure things out from context. And that goes very smoothly in some ways, but it also takes a lot of words because you can't just be like condensed information.
Yeah.
Actually, last week I had a friend who was here to visit, and I started my reread of Labyrinth's Heart. She was just reading Liar's Knot for the first time, and I think every time there was information given, we stopped and we started talking about how you do exposition in the book because we just appreciated it a lot, actually. And I think it was especially also with when like the primordials come up. By the way, I'm not going to go into any specific spoilers, especially when it comes to book 3. But yeah, especially with the primordials, where we were like, well, along the entirety of the book of the Liar's Knot, we get the information on the primordials bit by bit. So when we then actually need the big information and maybe need a sentence to fully explain it, that one sentence really is enough, and we don't need 2 pages of, well, they're this power and and then and yeah, I think it's really true what you said also, that a lot of the world building is done through the characters. I think that was also my favorite part of Labyrinth's Heart, is getting Ren's perspective on Brazilian culture, and just her feeling so lost and yet belonging into that culture, and her conflict with that culture, because I think it also helps bring in nuance, because you then don't really have that the nobles and the leganti and they're the bad guys, and the Brazilians and they're the victims, which obviously, yes, in a colonizing situation, but also there's the bigger historical context that has grown over 200 years.
Yeah, we definitely wanted, like, we had active conversations about this, of wanting to make sure that it's not like things came across, like, politically, yes, the Leganti were the invaders, they've been holding power for 200 years in a bad way, like, there's not really a question on the political spectrum, but, like, on the level of the culture and the individuals, we didn't want to make it Leganti culture does things the bad way, and the way Versenians do those things is the good way. So this comes up around, like, family, that for Versenians, it is very much about blood relationships, to the point where if you are like adopting someone into your family, it's a we're going to make a cut and literally mingle our blood as a part of that. Whereas for the Leganti, relationships have a much more sort of contractual air. It's like you can just legalistically adopt somebody and form these relationships in a much more kind of like structured in law sort of fashion. And basically, both groups kind of think the other one is doing it wrong. And we wanted to show with the different characters how both of those approaches can be good and they can be bad. Because I don't think, audiences probably know that, yeah, your blood family can be really bad for you. But families of choice can also get messed up, right? So it's not like one of them is the solution. Your life will be great if you just do it this way.
Yeah, I think I remember I'm not there yet again, but in the Labyrinth's Heart, I think there were like a couple of chapters, one after the other, that kind of went, or maybe it was just one chapter that went through that family theme for the different characters, one after the other.
We might have juxtaposed those for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, family is one of my favorite themes to go through in books. And found family. I mean, it is such a popular trope for a reason, I'm gonna say. So just connecting everything is just it's very enjoyable to read. From a character perspective. I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, I have to pull up my question again. Yeah, that was the other thing with culture. What I found really interesting is how you use language to define culture in the series. How did you go about that? Where did the idea come from? Because especially the Brasenians are using like a different, not grammatical structure, but a different word structure, which I'm not actually sure if the books got a German translation, how that would work. Because I think
they're going to get a German translation. So we'll see.
Yes, we just signed a contract for that like a couple weeks ago. It was very recent. So
that's amazing. Amazing. Yeah. That makes me so happy, because the German translation publishing fantasy market is honestly, yeah, I could rant about it for ages. I mean, it's a whole thing with German publishers often preferring translating popular English authors compared to publishing German authors, but then also again there's just a lot of things happening with just the big names getting translated. Right. So seeing this series getting the love and possibly getting a translation makes me very happy, and I'm definitely gonna check out. But back to the question, like how did this start with the with the language? And
well, I will say Maria's the big language geek. So in a lot of cases, especially when you're talking about language structure and things like that, it's like 95% on her. I do very little on that side. I I do a lot more with like slang and kind of slang terms. I think we pretty much equally contribute to those kinds of things. But yeah, for
I think the slang might tilt more towards you, if only because so much of it comes out of Arcady's mouth, and you write
yeah,
most of Arcady's dialogue. But um, yeah, the language stuff, it was something where I had that idea moderately early on, but didn't actually try to implement it until after we had sold the Mask of Mirrors, that I wanted there to be a noticeable difference, especially particularly for Ren, so that you would know when is she being Renata, the noblewoman that she's pretending to be, and when is she being herself, or Arenza, which is the name that she uses when she's going around kind of in a Versenian persona. Um, and that came partly out of the role-playing game that these books arise out of, because Ren is my player character. Um, not like we've made a secret of that. And in the game, when we're playing, I switch accents to show which persona she's in. So when I'm playing Renata, or like her as Renata, then I'm using a British accent, and I do a more Slavic one when she's being Versenian. Uh, and that's a thing that was just very baked into my concept of the character. But you don't want to try to do like phonetic spelling on the page for the most part. Like, that is bad in a bunch of different ways. Like, tiny amounts of it can go by. Like, when I wrote a Cockney character, I did drop the H's out of it because it's the easiest way to make the reader hear Cockney in their head. But when I was writing that Cockney character, one of the things I looked up was the structures of how Cockney grammar tends to work. Like, where are the places that the verb, like they'll use a singular instead of a plural verb, or other kind of non-standard grammatical things, and using much more of that to convey the flavor of this character speaks in a particular dialect. So with the Versenians, then it was, I've got to decide what that dialect sounds like. And it's not based on any specific real world community. It's me choosing a few features that we could then put into their words. One of the key ones is it gets called meaningless do in English. Like, what did you think? Most other languages would say, what thought you, instead, rather
yeah.
than sticking in this did that isn't really, it doesn't mean anything. It just signals this is a question. So dropping that out was an easy way for us to make it clear to the reader, this person speaks in the more Versenian dialect. So yeah, then I had to go through the entirety of the Mask of Mirrors and rewrite the dialogue of all of the Versenian characters. Should have done
And
that
then
earlier.
I was gonna say, and then I did the no Yoda pass.
Yeah, we dialed it back a little. Yeah,
Yeah.
because some of the like change ups in kind of the order of words in the sentence, the list was like, nope, this is too much. It's starting to sound like Yoda. So we watered it down a bit.
So we found like a
But
good balance. Yeah.
yeah, but then also things like a lot of the names of things, I'm the one who ends up picking them because my subconscious is incredibly choosy about this, much more than Alyssa's is. Alyssa will just be like,
Very
that's a fine name, and
very often what will happen is I will either put together a list of or toss out a bunch of possible names that fit, generally fit our orthographics and everything. And then Marie will go in and fiddle around with them and fix them and change them and get it to where she can kind of handle the name. Uh,
yeah, it needs to sing for me. My subconscious will complain if it doesn't. And so, like, even especially for minor characters, like, we're going along, we're drafting, and just quietly, like, the vowel in somebody's name changes, and I'm like, just find and replace. I didn't like that O there. I wanted it to be an E. It's but I had fun doing a few things to try to make it hang together. I noticed this when I read Amanda Downham's novel, The Drowning City. Um, I'm blanking now on the actual names, but there's the name of the river, and then the name of the big city that is on that river contains the name of the river within it. I'm like, that makes sense to me. That feels like plausible naming. And so I built up a few clusters where you get like the River Dejera, and then Nadejra is the city that's on it. And so like that was probably Dejera, Nadejra, like all together, and it got a little bit shortened over time. Or like the goddess Ajarais, and then Aja is the drug that supposedly lets you see into the Ajarais' dream, this realm. Just building up these things where like, yeah, there's little connections between them that it makes it sound like these words probably have something to do with each other, without going full Tolkien and actually building out like the entire linguistic history. Just little touches of it, I think, go along.
I find it funny because I am someone who very passively notices language usually. So I think the first time around that I read it, I didn't even that consciously notice Arenza changing from Renata. But on the second time around, it was just so obvious to me. But it's also the type of reader I am. The first time around, I read for story, and the second time, and maybe notice some tidbits. And the second time around, I'm suddenly like, oh my God, there's so much there. I think with the naming conventions generally, it just makes it very clear who is what and who belongs where. Did you also then change something for making clear who is like Nadeshdan, who isn't Liganti and Rosenian, but who belongs to this city and just to this mixed heritage, basically?
There's certainly a few names. Well, I mean, like the obvious one is Vargo, who basically, like, his surname is probably Versenian, but he chose a Liganti first name for himself at one point. And so his name, has a bit of that mix. And there's certainly some other names where you would look at it and think, well, I don't know, maybe it could be either. So we're not necessarily always putting people in just one box or the other, because you do get linguistic mixing. And you'll get like something that started off in, okay, that was a Leganti name, but then it got sort of Versenianified a little. The clearest place that happens in the other direction is Gray Serrato, one of our main characters. There are two different spellings of his last name, depending on the context that he's in. It's pronounced the same way, but the way it is for like his actual Versenian surname, but he goes by a Leganti spelling of it, which is a thing that a lot of immigrants into the US have in their family history. So
I think another place where we had some fun with names, especially more for side characters, was, so we have these like names of the week and names of the month, and we actually have a lot of characters who are named some derivative of the names of the month. So it's like Pavlin, Kolbrin, Simlin, like all these kind of side and secondary characters are basically your equivalent of, June and April and, August and things like that.
Since we're already at it's just a very specific question, and I don't know, it was something that just came to my mind when I watched your video with I forgot the name right now, but about the clothing, when I watched your interview
with the Snappy Dragon. Yeah,
very specific, maybe really random question, but is there a reason the Rook has gloves? Because gloves in the story are such a big Leganti thing.
I mean, really, the answer for anything about why does the Rook dress the way he does is a combination of Alfred Noyes, the Highwayman, and Assassin's Creed. Like, that's the actual answer.
I will say that is the actual answer. I will say, because we do mention this a couple times, I've been listening to the audiobook of Labyrinth's Heart, because I like to hear, what Nikki has done, Nikki Masood, our audiobook narrator. And I recently got to the scene where Tess bemoans the fact that Nadezhrins are so anti-glove that they don't wear them even when it would make sense, as a kind of a protest. And so she's like kind of got, wind-chapped cold hands. And I think there is an element to gloves were probably not something that Versenians and 200 years ago had any particular bias against. It's a cultural bias that kind of seeped in as one of these kinds of separators. And so when the Rook was made, like gloves were just, things you wore when it was cold or when you needed to protect your hands. And so, that has changed, and it has become a cultural sticking point. Even when it would make sense, possibly for people to wear gloves, it's still like, well, I'm not going to wear gloves like those cheese eaters, that kind of a thing.
Yeah. I think the other part of it is just the anonymizing of the Rook. That, like, if you could see the Rook's hands, then you might be able to recognize who it is based on the hands. But if you have, like, everything is covered and the face is in shadow, then there's really nothing for you to latch onto. So it makes it easier to achieve that anonymity.
Yeah, as I said, really random question. I don't know. I think for me, I mean, obviously clothing plays a huge role in it. And I'm just going to link your other interview down in the description box so we don't have to go through everything again. But the big part that I just noticed over and over again, where there was also just so much storytelling and cultural storytelling in it, was always the gloves. especially when you have two characters from different backgrounds with gloves. I only this morning read one of the scenes in Labyrinth's Heart that I'm not gonna say, where once again it plays a very important cultural role, but I can't go into it because that would be spoilers, so not gonna say anything. So I'm gonna not do the mistake that I usually do in my reviews and leave the stuff that I actually want to talk about most for last. So the queerness, the queer world building. Where did it start? Where did you also get your inspirations from? Like, how did you come up with the different levels of queerness that obviously, like, in similar forms exist in different cultures in our world as well? Were there specific inspirations that you maybe came across in while studying, or was it just
Well, I think I mean, I don't even think we really like discussed should we have a queer normative world so much as it was kind of a starting assumption that we both kind of, as we were world building, just kind of kept agreeing to. I don't know, Marie, if you recall any particular conversation, but I know
I think I do remember, like, it was specifically, you know, you mentioning that you wanted to make sure that we included it. So I remember you being kind of like the point person on that one.
okay. And I know I've talked about this a little bit before, but I know for me it has just a lot to do with um, the kind of ways that you can walk into, like, every fiction is kind of a little bit of a, you're a little wary of it if you're a queer or genderqueer person, because you're always kind of hunched up a little bit expecting potential, like some potential microaggression of some sort, or macroaggression in some cases. And that sometimes it's, especially because it's fantasy, and in fantasy the authors are making choices. It's not like the world, you know um works a particular way outside of you. It's like you are making the choice to say the world works this way. And so when we have that opportunity to be able to say, I can relax a little bit in this world, I don't have to have that hunched up, and readers don't have to have that, like, clenched kind of feeling. And so I think that that's important. I think there are important work to be done to address, like, real world issues with how gender and gender identity and sexuality are treated in our society and other societies in this world. But I think it's nice to not have to deal with that on occasion. But yeah, and then I know for when we were talking about how does it look in this world, I know one of the things that we've often talked about is that sometimes, especially you see this in sci-fi series, but you also see this sometimes how it's handled in fantasy, where it just sounds like people are talking about our contemporary culture and how, we view these things. And again, it's not that there's, not need for and great places for those kinds of conversations, but when you're talking about a different culture, and we've, seen this, as anthropologists in other cultures contemporarily and in the past around the world, um, there's just so many other ways that people have understood gender and sexuality, and built relationships around it. And I think one of the things that we talked about early on a lot was, especially around, like, marriage and inheritance, so much of our ways that we prescribe certain gender roles and certain ways that people come together have to do with marriage inheritance. And so one of the early things that we talked about was, okay, so if that's the case, then how does that make sense in these, this gender neutral and queer normative world, or not gender neutral, but this queer normative world, how do we address that?
Yeah.
uh,
And we
yeah.
also definitely talked about the fact that we chose the route of giving each culture sort of a specific way that they understand and deal with certain kinds of, like, gender queerness in particular, rather than trying to have all the possibilities in this one setting. And in particular, because there are certain things about the world building, specifically around, like, the duality in religion with the faces and the masks, or the Leganti understand them as separate deities but in pairs. Um, it means that both Leganti and Versenian society have clear and well-accepted ideas of being trans, but they don't particularly have any like third gender, agender, kind of non-binary approach to things, because we sort of had binariness built in ways that we just felt that's going to flavor how they view this. And so it's not necessarily that those people don't exist, it's just that there's not a culturally defined concept of this that everybody knows about and accepts the way there is for the trans characters. And then we also, again, with that sort of trying to come up with different ways for each culture to do it, that with Versenian culture, we very much took our ideas from some real world things. I know the touchstone I kept going back to was Albanian sworn virgins, which there's going to be some people in your audience who go, well, yes, I know about those. And other people will say,
I was like, that was actually what I was thinking about as well.
Yeah, because Versenian society does have a few social roles that are gender locked, that like sources, the pattern readers are all female, and courage leaders, clan elders, like basically the leaders of these lineages and such, are all male. But you don't have to have been assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. So it is that Albanian sworn virgin. You're taking on the other gender role in this, like, there's a reason for it kind of way. And it could go either way, of either somebody does it because not so much like, oh, I feel male and therefore I want to do this. It's, I want to be the courage leader, so if I have to live as a guy to do that, I'll do it. And then there will be other people who say, well, that's how I feel inside me, so I guess this is the social path I'm going down in terms of where I land in society. And same with Sorsas. But then Leganti society, they're just like, okay, that's how you feel, cool. Like, there's not a need for there to be a social channel you're going down. You can just kind of, that's who you are. And that was part of our trying to make sure that it's not, oh, Leganti society bad, Versenian society good. That, like, Versenians are a little more restrictive around it in ways that are, maybe not ideal because they're not perfect.
I think that's also what I personally appreciated, because the Leganti way is very much or more like our modern understanding of what queerness is, which very much has to do with personal identity. But then the Brazilian culture is something that, from an anthropologist's point of view, I just very much appreciate in a world building, because it just brings to the forefront how much gender and culture really can't be separated from each other. And also, like, where does queerness begin? Where does do gender roles end? Like, it's really, you can't separate it from each other. I also enjoyed how, especially with Pavlin's character, you have this very central side character who is trans, which in the first two books doesn't really come to the forefront that much. Aside maybe that Pavlin, but that's just Pavlin again. I loved how every time there was just a pretty hawk somewhere in the background. Oh, it's the rogue Pavlin. But in the third book, obviously, it comes up again, the transness in the finale.
Well, and this also came up in our Reddit AMA of we did wrestle a little bit with how much do we want to be reminding the reader, by the way, this character is trans, as opposed to establishing it up front and then just not mentioning it again, because in their society, it's not a thing that is going to be repeatedly called out as somehow unusual. And we erred more on the side of not reminding the reader a bunch, which means that some readers have actually forgotten that the character is trans. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. But it does mean that, it is possible for that detail to slip your mind, especially if you haven't been rereading the books. You pick up The Liar's Knot, by that point, you've forgotten that Pavlin's trans. Well,
yeah, I think for me, it was the first time I overread it, because it was one sentence. But again, the first time I read for plot, the second time I read for details. And then, yeah, then I noticed again. So I think, Alice, you wanted to say something?
I don't remember. I do know, yeah, kind of just building on what Maria was saying, of also being very considerate about how we marked it. The ways that you can market in text are sometimes challenging or problematic, and so we were very careful and conscious about how we were calling that out, how we're marking it.
That how are we marking it that was particularly a challenge around introducing Pavlin because it was the first time that we were bringing it up in text. And
Yeah.
same thing with then, like, how do we mark the Versenian version of it and tell you what those terms mean? But once we established the terminology, it then got easier because, like, Tiama Kapeni appears in The Liar's Knot, and we're just like, and she's an Earthwise woman. And at that point, if you have been, eyeing these details, which not everybody has been, you can just say Earthwise woman, and you're like, okay, we know what she is, rather than needing to like go into explaining that to you. So it is hardest on the first use, and then after that, you've got your terminology, and you can just use it.
And because, as I said earlier, I mean, gender roles and queerness can't really be separated, but the gender relations in the Rook and Rose series, I mean, they don't become as noticeable as in other fantasy stories, where quite often there's this imagined medieval gender relations thing. What was your goal when writing about gender in this series? Because I'm assuming you were also talking about that or thinking about that, what you wanted to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we even had some discussion about, did we want to keep the idea, which had come from the game, that sources had to be female, that the leaders of the various lineages had to be male, because in general we are writing about a setting where there's not a lot of kind of gender disparity in that regard, and we decided to keep
Yeah.
that bit because we felt it lent some interesting sort of flavors to things. But yes, overall we did deliberately take the approach of not trying to like gender segregate or have there be a lot of inequality, that pretty much any of the roles in Nadezhra can be taken on by someone of any gender. I remember us talking about how Sostira Novaris is basically like the alpha male jerk out of like a 1980s romance in her approach to things, except she's a woman. So
Yeah. And I think I will say, like, some of the challenges behind that honestly are not um keeping aware of and not replicating our own biases that just are so ingrained that even though, you know, these are things we think about, it's still sometimes just seeps in through the writing. And so, paying attention to who's doing the acting and who's doing the speaking and who's are in roles of power. I know we had a very long conversation about a particular plot point in Labyrinth's Heart, so I won't give any spoilers. Um, but there's a particular large sequence in the first part of the book that in its first iteration, and we kind of had to think through, could have actually had like some kind of uncomfortable suggestions about the selling of a woman's marriage
yeah, like
prospects,
woman as prize, basically.
woman as prize, basically. And we had a lot of conversations about, okay, how do we do this really cool thing we want to do without just replicating this kind of thing that we don't want to
Yeah.
represent in our society or agree with. Yeah. uh,
Especially because both of us are often inspired by things from like folklore and such, and you get a lot of those patterns of like, and then yes, your reward for having done this thing is you get to marry this woman, and we're like, we like the story up until that point. How do we get the feel of this without ending it with, and now we will hand over a woman as a reward?
With the world building, for each of you, what would you say is your favorite detail about the world building that maybe not every reader would have found?
That's tough.
I I like all the little things we have about the way that the river figures in daily life. There's just like a
Mm.
bunch of little things, like from the whole thing with water bearers having to come like collect water in the East Channel and then bring it over the old island to the West Channel because the water's a mess. The whole thing from the first book about the skiff market, where it's basically like this kind of market that's set out on little kind of tiny boats at docks and things like that that can uh, break apart and very quickly because legally the people who are running the market aren't allowed to sell in established shops. Like all these like kind of little things that we bring the river into the ways that the entire settlement of Staveswater out past Turtle Lagoon, which is basically like this kind of shanties built up on piles. Um, like I just really like the different ways that we make the river central to people's everyday lives. And so anytime we could bring something of that in, as you know, it's not just color, because obviously it becomes very important in book 3 for a couple of different reasons. um I really always had fun with anything we did with the river.
And I think kind of related to that, we have this habit that we kind of consciously noticed ourselves doing and decided to lean into, of having put like the big blocks of our world building in place. Then it became, how can we reference that and work it in smaller ways? So one of our things is that when we're reaching for metaphorical language, a lot of the time it's, okay, so how can we work in like the river and flooding and mud and turtles and just anything river related? Can we reach for that in going for a metaphor here or a simile? And not just with the river, that as soon as we named the deck of cards that are used in Versenian culture, the pattern deck, all of a sudden, boom, textile motifs everywhere in Versenian culture. Like we worked on, I think Alyssa was the one who suggested slipknot as a term for a Versenian who seems to have like kind of betrayed their people to like go over to the Leganti, because we wanted to avoid the usual English language idioms for that are all based around food, of like, you know, one color on the outside, white on the inside. So like, what can we do that sounds more Versenian? Slipknot. It's, you know, that knot that you can't trust to hold. Or with the numinatria, the geometric magic that the Leganti practice, we started coming up with these phrases that I just really loved, of, you know, well, if I were as rich as Quarat, or, you know, we all thought he was dead as Ninot, or that woman was sober as Sebat, that we could just reference it in a way that reinforces your understanding of the magic system and makes you believe it really is important to the culture, while
Yeah.
also letting us come up with phrases that aren't the standard cliches, you know, like dead as a doornail. People have heard dead as a doornail a million times. They have not heard dead as Ninot. So I liked all the places we could just sort of stuff those into the corners of the sentences.
Yeah.
When it then fits together with the plot, not going into spoilers.
Exactly.
But since we're already talking about pattern and Numinatra, I mean, once again, I'm scared that I'm praising too much right now, that I'm coming on too strong.
We don't mind.
But basically, the world building in this does not world building, magic in this does exactly what, again, I personally really love from my fantasy, because I know a lot of people love very hard magic systems now and very sciencey magic systems, and it's all explained. But for me, I'm not really that interested in how the magic works. I'm more interested in how it works in relation to the society, to the culture, to the world. The bigger picture. How did you go about creating those 2/3 magic systems with imbuing, obviously?
Or imbuing, it's the redheaded stepchild no one ever remembers.
Where one does seem quite a bit more sciencey, where the other is. I say that you could say Numinatria is more hard magic, Pattern is more soft magic, but I still don't think it fits.
I was gonna say that's really only how they would like to sell it.
Yeah. But how did you go about creating those two systems and also having them so rooted in their respective cultures while still working together within the broader world building?
There's a certain amount of, you know, you said like rooted in their cultures. It went a little bit the other way around, that because we came up with the idea for these traditions, and then we said, okay, with that as a touchstone, what's the culture we're building around it? Because we knew that these were going to be very important to the story. And so it went a bit more that those traditions drove a lot of the cultural world building. Like I said, I mean, pattern, the minute we named it the pattern deck, all kinds of pieces of Versenian culture started taking shape, because we went, textiles, that's our imagery and our touchstone here. Okay. Um, Pattern was pretty much my baby in the world building. I was the one. I mean, I was consulting with Alyss, but I kind of came up with the structure of the deck and what were the cards signifying, and what were some of the ways of reading it. And then we both beat our heads against the wall of naming all the cards. that that was the problem with not doing a numbered deck. We couldn't just say, ah, this is the 5 of, coins or whatever. We had to come up with a name for every single card. That part wasn't fun. But pattern was the one that I worked on, and it did involve sort of asking myself a lot of questions of like, okay, how many suits? And I didn't want to do 4 because that was going to feel like a Western deck, or like the tarot, has like 4 suits in it. And 5 just, I don't know, seemed like a lot, so I said 3, which tied in well with we have 3 protagonists, and the number 3 started recurring a bunch in the series as a result. um, and putting in the faces and the masks, which we had as an idea for Versenian religion. And so, okay, now I have to define what are those gods, which are the ones that are being represented in the deck here, what are the concepts that they're going to focus on, how are they going to be grouped into these categories, which like the fact that one of these suits, one of the threads, is focused on what they call the outer self, which is to say relationships and social institutions. Having that be a category within the deck fit with the very sort of communal feeling that a lot of stuff in Versenian culture has, where it is about you being linked to other people, not just you as your solo heroic self or whatever. So yeah, we ended up deciding a lot of the culture through the lens of figuring out how the deck was going to be structured. And then meanwhile, Numenatria was Alyssa's baby.
Well, and I was going to say, I think just with pattern, I think even like Azurice, like as like a kind of godhead, um, developed out of that, because I don't think we had started her out as this kind of goddess of intuition and dreams, but as we were developing pattern and other things in the city, it just started to
Yeah.
coalesce that this made the most sense for her. And then yeah, so since Marie was doing the bulk of the work on pattern, we were like, okay, well, so it makes sense for me to do Numenatria, especially since Vargo was more in my wheelhouse and he was going to be the Numenatrian expert. And I had kind of an idea that because we did have like Ceteris and Seste Legante being a very, Italian Latin kind of vibe. And I had this idea that I wanted to do something around like kind of hermetic ritual magic, which I'm familiar with from just interest in that kind of stuff. And then like sacred geometry, numerology kind of stuff. And so Marie hands me this book that she says, I think this might be useful for you. I actually got it off the shelf this time. So she hands me this book, and I go away for a weekend. I read the book. It's actually really, really, really interesting. It's called A Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe, The Mathematical Archetypes of Nature, Art, and Science, A Voyage from 1 to 10 by Michael S. Snyder. I can send you that if you want to link it or whatever. Um, but it's a really interesting book that talks about all the places that we see numbers and the geometric shapes associated with them in nature, in science, in art, all the way through. And so it really kind of formed the basis of the when you're talking about Sarah, the way you like magic systems as this, not this hard science thing. It's like got this science underpinning of how we view numbers, but it's got this very kind of poetic. I talk about slippage, and the way that magic esoteric systems often work is there's all this kind of slippage between ideas where you can um, make associations and intuitive leaps and things like this that allow a system of cards when you're doing an oracle deck or something like Numenatria to feel like they're taking on these greater meanings and allow you to do a kind of pattern recognition with them. And so that's kind of what I did when I was making Numenatria is I took these meanings that these numbers tend to have and that we tend to associate with these numbers, um, and kind of organized it around that, and then kind of figured out like, okay, so what would this look like, and how would this work with how we've kind of defined how energy works in our setting, and how kind of like connections to the godhead, connections to the divine work to pull energy into magic, because we have very religious based magic, or not religious, but like, divine power based magic. Uh, and so, yeah, so I spent a weekend fiddling with that, and I came back to Marie on like Monday with like a 10-page document that was like, here's Numenatria.
And I should note here, I gave this book to Alyssa saying, "Oh, I think this will be helpful to you." And Alyssa leaves, and I have a moment where I think, I last read that book 20 years ago when I was in high school. God, I hope it's not embarrassingly stupid. Like, I remember liking it, but what is Alyssa gonna think of it? They're gonna think it's dumb, maybe. I don't know. And yes, then Monday rolls around and boom, 10-page document. Like, oh, I guess it was helpful.
And I will say at the time, I was also like, I was reading like Gödel Escherbach and things like that. And so those were all kind of very informative as well for what was
Yeah.
going on in my brain.
Yeah, but I've come to realize that it's not even that I object so much to the magic systems where there are clear rules and the rules are laid out clearly for the reader. It really is that thing you were saying, Sarah, of I dislike it when it feels as if it's completely disconnected from the rest of the world, like it's been just sort of
Yeah.
stapled onto the side of the setting and isn't really interfacing with anything else there. And so that's why things like, okay, we have these numinata that are, used for magical effects and these, kind of sacred ideas of these numbers, and people will also just use them in slang because they would. And they're going to like wear certain colors or put certain images on their clothing and their masks and such because of the associations with this magic. Like, what are
Yeah.
all the places we can bring it into the rest of the culture?
I mean, I know there's a story with you, Marie, and using pattern to help you with the plot. Is there, I mean, we can go into the story afterwards, but is there maybe also something similar with Numenatria and you, Alice? Or
I mean, not so much help with it. I mean, there are many places where I've sat down and kind of figured out, okay, this is sort of how the Numenat would have looked. Like these are the different figures that would exist in it. Um, More like figuring out, okay, if Vargo was making this Numenat to do this thing, what would that actually be? So not really so much informing the plot, but there are definitely, especially at the structural level, choices we made that um, that we made because of their associations with certain numbers,
Yeah.
up to and including like the way that the books are broken apart into
Yes.
different parts and things like that.
Yeah.
Has definitely informed the structure of the books in particular.
Yeah.
and
And
did you
I
chart
will
any of the characters?
we have
Sorry.
actually we have horoscopes
Oh,
for a lot
Okay.
of them.
yeah.
Yes,
No,
Alyssa worked out their astrological.
we have their birth dates and their horoscopes for a lot of them. I've got a whole setup in one of my art programs that's basically I can put together a horoscope in about a half hour,
Mhm.
20 minutes to a half hour. Um, because yeah, that's fun.
I was laughing a moment ago because there are certain sort of concepts which once you get them into your head just don't want to leave. And so now I've got things of like I realize that when I'm making tea and I'm kind of, swishing it up and swishing the infuser up and down in the tea a little bit before I lift it out. And there's just like a tendency to do that 8 times because Naktat is associated with like sensory pleasures and such. I'm like, really, really, self? Did I need to? But once you get the numbers in your head, you start getting superstitious about them sometimes.
Well, I was going to say, I know that I think you had said something about when you shuffle a deck of cards, 7 is the optimal
Yes.
shuffle to get a perfect or to get the most kind of
Yeah.
churn.
Yeah, the
And
most
so I always shuffle
randomization.
my cards 7 times, which is an interesting kind of joining between or intersection between Numenatria and pattern is the number 7. Um, the importance in both of those for that. Yeah.
And maybe Marie, for those of you who don't know yet, I mean, you do have it on your website, but how did you use pattern to?
So again, because of the game, in the game, character did like some fortune telling stuff, and so I had a deck of cards that I would shuffle and deal, and then Alyssa would look at what I had dealt, and on the basis of what I rolled with my skill, make up some interpretation that would be more or less informative. And we really liked doing that because I mean it was a
Yeah.
giant pain in the neck for Alyssa, but it made things really interesting in the game. And so we knew we wanted to have a deck in the story, and we decided early on that we were going to do the same thing. we don't ever, except when Ren is like cold decking somebody, or there's a few times where a ritual is done where a pattern is being deliberately constructed. But anytime it's just being dealt normally, I didn't think to put it within arm's reach here, but I have a blank deck of cards that I wrote on with Sharpie. And every time we needed a pattern, I shuffled those and I dealt them, and whatever I laid is what went into the book. And there were places where that got really interesting. Most notably, there's one pattern in the Mask of Mirrors where, without going into spoilers, Ren is trying to pattern someone that we had agreed ahead of time had mystical defenses. And in fact, I don't even think it's a spoiler to say she tries to pattern the Rook. And the Rook is magical and, has defenses that will keep people from just sort of prying into who is the Rook and so forth. And we deal out the cards, and the middle one, which we had already established in a 9-card spread, like this is the key to everything. I deal out the cards, and the middle card is basically like, hi, do you want answers for who the Rook is? Here they are. Like, no, we don't want Ren to have those answers, not until book 2. And we had to lean on that magical defenses thing, which is why Ren gets a migraine there. That she tries to look at the card, and her brain just goes, nope, we are not doing that. Because the deck tried to be too helpful, basically. She wanted an answer and she got it, and we said no, she can't have that.
Aside from that, was there a deck on the opposite side that just didn't work at all with where you were going?
There were at least a few. Like, they're right at the beginning of the novel, Ren and Leato go to a patterner who lays out cards, and we give, because Leato gets patterned first, and so this is the reader's introduction to this idea, and Ren is watching, we're in her point of view, so we use it to explain a lot of what do the cards mean and their positioning and so forth. And then the source of patterns, Ren. And so it was partly us being like, we do not need to do 2 of these in depth back to back. The reader is going to get very bored with us explaining cards to them. But also we laid out that one and just kind of went, meh, it's not that great, which was fitting because that patterner maybe wasn't that great.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I remember like we struggled with that one for a little bit, and just in writing that scene, because it was also just a weird scene, because so you've got a patterner who isn't Ren who's laying these cards, and so we don't know like if she has a connection to Azurize or how mystically connected and significant this reading is. And then you've got Ren trying to read the cards that this other person put down and understand them for what they mean for Leato. And so, and then us like giving her some false understandings and interpretations because she doesn't know what's going on, and the cards aren't significant because the patterner. That was a very hard one to write, because we were playing on multiple levels of who understood what and how magically significant they actually were. And so Ren actually comes away from that scene with some misunderstandings about what is going on.
Since we're at pattern, maybe this is a good point. When I'm gonna be uploading this video, hopefully, if my internet is nice to me, there'll still be a week left of your Kickstarter, which is obviously to get our own pattern deck, plus maybe other goodies.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we are running a Kickstarter right now, which, as of us recording this video, is not only fully funded, but has made it to its 3rd stretch goal, which is really, really exciting.
Congrats.
Yes, thank you. And we've got 3 artists lined up. One of them has designed the back of the cards for us, and then 2 others are going to be splitting the rest of the deck between themselves. One of them is doing the faces and the masks, and the other is doing the rest of the cards, so that we get kind of that, like, artistic coherence to them. If you go to the Kickstarter page, you will see the sample cards that we paid for out of pocket ahead of time to, show people what the deck will look like. They are gorgeous. And even if you see this video after it closes on September 5th, we will be setting up on BackerKit, where you can continue to pre-order the deck while our artists go off and paint the rest of it, so that by the time we actually print them, we will be able to include you in the order and you won't have missed out on your chance.
Yeah, I will leave the Kickstarter link down below. I did already back it.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Better judgment, but
and we will note By the way, that there are some options that are digital only for people who, like, the international shipping is horrible, and there's not a lot we can do about
Yeah.
that. And also, there are a number of add-ons and such, which you can get all of them at the $1 tier, so that if you're like, well, I don't care about the deck, but those tea samples sound really delicious, or I would like my horoscope from Alyssa or whatever, then you can still get those without having to get a deck along with them.
Maybe moving from the world building, as much as it hurts me, a question that always interests me with any authors is the question if there are characters that are particularly easy to write and characters that are particularly hard to write, and why.
So I was going to say, I because of the way this started out and the way we started out collaborating, um, ironically, Ren is the hardest character for me to write, or was for a long time. I think I'm better. I got better at her towards, the end in Labyrinth's Heart and everything like that. But, that started out, Ren was Marie's PC in the game I was running, and so uh, she wanted to do something that was a kind of a side caper. It wouldn't have really involved any of the other players or characters in the game. And so I said, well, why don't we run that as a scene and like write it back and forth as a scene? And so we did that. And then we had so much fun that we did it again and we did it again. And by the time like Marie noticed we had gotten about 50,000 words into writing these various scenes with her character, interacting mainly with this vigilante uh, street justice character, the Rook, and then also a couple other characters, we were like, well, why don't we actually collaborate on something that, we could potentially send out? And so because of that, Marie was writing all of Ren's perspective and everything like that, and I was writing the NPCs and the kind of world and challenges she would come up against, and we would often kind of collaborate on how that might go. And so when we transitioned from that to the novel, even though we started sharing the work more equally, it still was very much the case that when we were writing a scene from Ren's perspective, I would tend to write the other characters that she was interacting with, or environmental details and things like that. And so I found Ren a hard character to get into because for so long that was Marie's character. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, I had an easier time. Obviously, Ren was the one who was very comfortable for me because I had been doing a bunch of writing from her perspective. She was a character I had made. Gray, I actually got, I think, a decent handle on back when we were still playing around with game scenes. Vargo took a lot longer for me. Like, that was the one I had trouble with. And then for characters that are much more like not people we had written about in game, I basically don't think I can write Arcady because I do not have the inner foul-mouthed 12-year-old that Alyssa does. So I just, it's not like I couldn't put Arcady into a scene, but it just wouldn't feel vivid. It would feel like watered down substitute Arcady.
At least for you, was there a character that was particularly easy?
I mean, I love writing Arcady. I find Tess to be an incredibly easy voice to get into. When uh, especially because my preference is to write by hand. And so when Marie and I were writing, we were writing in a shared Google Doc, but sometimes I would go off and I would write little bits by hand just because it was easier for me to think that way. And yeah, Tess was pretty easy. Arcady, um, I find Vargo pretty easy and fun to write, and especially when Vargo is bantering with Alceus, I could just write those two like chatting away at each other all the time. Yeah.
And I
They
think
are.
there were a few others where they were kind of difficult for both of us in the sense of we had to very carefully calibrate how we were working them into the story. And so
Yeah.
in particular, I'd say a couple of the antagonists who show up in Labyrinth's Heart, it was like, okay, we've got to kind of pick our way one step at a time, figure out how we're going to do this, rather
Yeah.
than it arising a little bit more naturally from, I can kind of hear the character in my head and just go with it.
Yeah.
It had to be a little bit more calculated.
And I think interestingly, one of the characters that came easily to us and ended up getting a remarkable character shift early on because of it was Tomaquist. Because when we started out going into Mask of Mirrors, we had a particular plan for her, and when we started writing her and her personality and character started coming out, and we started kind of discovering things about her as we wrote her, we kind of looked at her and went, she's far more interesting than we originally had kind of what we had planned for her. And so we changed our
So we
our
were always
approach
going to
to
have
her.
we were always going to have her playing a large role in the story. I don't know that it's that her role in the story we changed so much, but it is absolutely true that she did not show up with the personality we had planned on. Like,
No,
she appeared on the page and we're like, oh, well, that's who you're going to be, apparently. And it was
yes,
not what we had thought. She was going to be a much more sort of like controlled scientific sort, instead of the kind of like perpetually distracted, etc.
In terms of writing process, like how did you go about it? Were you like, okay, everyone's gonna write some scenes, or character wise, or how did you
Well,
go
because of
about
the game stuff that Alyssa mentioned, we from the start did a very sort of fine-grained back and forth. That like it sometimes was on the level of like one line of dialogue. Okay, back to you. You give the response. I write the next line. Um, and then, other parts it might be I'm going to write like 3 paragraphs of kind of getting this transition to happen, and then I'll toss it to you for the next, bit of action. Um, and so that is how we ended up mostly writing the books as well. I think over time we shifted into doing longer blocks rather than quite as much rapid back and forth as before. And every so often there are scenes, particularly if it's like, Tess and Pavlin are off doing their thing, or Ren is laying a pattern or something, then yeah, like Alyssa might go and write that whole bit themselves, and then I revise it, or I write the pattern scene and Alyssa revises it. So there are bits that we can point to and say that was definitely a large block of one or the other of us. But most of the scenes in the book, we probably traded it back and forth at least half a dozen times, if not more, to the
yeah,
point where even we aren't sure where the seams are anymore.
I think it comes through because it's very consistent in the writing. Because I mean, I sometimes when I read collaborations notice, but often not, but sometimes you can really tell who wrote what. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes that's not, but like I don't think it's either good or bad. It depends on the
Yeah.
story, as with so many things.
Yeah,
yeah,
there are different ways of doing it, and a lot of collaborations you'll see they take a much clearer, like each chapter is from one character's point of view, and you know that a specific author was writing all of that character's chapters. Because that's, a pretty easy way, or like at least a clear-cut way of dividing up the work. Ours was much more sort of messy and ad hoc, but we really like the fact that it produced a result where lots of people feel that they can't actually tell who wrote which bits. We're like, well, we can't tell either, so cool.
A question that I am sure a lot of people want the answer to, and that I definitely know that quite a few people in my book club wanted the answer to, was, is there another collaboration project in process?
There is. We have a thing currently with our agents, and it is, we can't give you any promises for what will happen with it, but we definitely had enough fun with this that we would like to do it again.
Is it a new
yeah,
world or
Yes, it is something new. Yeah. Um, Sadly, like we do have an idea that we both really like for another series in this setting, but it's not one that works as a good entry point for like new readers into the world. It is a little bit too much taking what happens in Labyrinth's heart and saying, ooh, there would be interesting consequences to those things, and making story out of that. Um, and so, yeah, it's just like professionally, it's not the best move to go with something like that. But
yeah.
I
It's
do,
very difficult. It's very difficult to find new readers for a series like that, and you're always going to get a dip in existing readers, and so
yeah.
it's a hard sell to most editors. Yeah, but
However, yeah, like if
maybe
we come
someday.
up with a different idea in the setting, one that is not so much building on the events of this one, I would actually really love to come back to the world because
Yeah,
we did so much development of it. It's like, why write only 3 bricks? We should write more.
Speaking of the ending, I have one last question that, however, might go slightly into spoiler territory. So I wanted to warn any watchers. I'm gonna do timestamps to skip that to the end if they want. But the thing that I found so very fascinating, and that for me, to be honest, is a reason why I always go into a lot of books that deal with colonial settings very hesitantly, is going the balance between being realistic, accepting that certain things can't have solutions, but also giving a happy ending, which you get in a way in this one, because it's very much, okay, we have a solution for now, in parentheses. So what were the points there that were important for you that you would hit on with the finale?
I mean, I think we were both in agreement of it's a really complicated situation, and you know, it's not one we've been able to elegantly solve in the real world. And so, you know, any way that we resolved it in the fantasy world that was, you know, too perfect would seem unrealistic. And so what we were really looking for in our resolution of that whole kind of situation was um, steps towards something that made sense within the culture, because obviously the um the solution that they come to at the end of the book for how they're moving forward is not something that would necessarily work in different places with different kinds of, you know, groups and everything. But within this culture, it's compromises that do make sense, we hope. um I don't know,
Yeah,
Marie, if you
and
were gonna.
I mean, I think I've been seeing different reactions to the ending from readers, and so I think there's an element of also how are you as the reader inclined to interpret what we put in there? Because we were certainly aiming for they have done things that are good changes that are not going to solve everything. It's not going
Yeah.
to become everybody links hands and sings Kumbaya together. It's going to be messier than that. And we tried to emphasize the ways in which it's going to be messy. But I think for some readers, they're going to note those things and say, ah, yes, I see realistic complexity here. And other people, it's going to seem too pat, right? Because we do
Yeah.
have, some great changes happen. I think we were able to lean a little bit on the fact that there is a metaphysical element that was underpinning the politics, which when you yank that out from underneath it, all of a sudden things become possible that you might not achieve in the real world.
Yeah.
But we definitely did want to feel like our characters had achieved something rather than like, well, you've sorted out your personal lives, but the politics are going to stay crappy. The end. Like,
Yeah. And I think also, you know, one of the things that was very important to us as with all the Stadna Meduska stuff was that this was a much bigger movement than just our three characters, and that
yes.
they aren't even the main actors in a lot of ways in this. And I know that might go against the way some people feel books and fantasy should be written, that your main characters should be the main actors and protagonists in, you know, large political complexity. But to us, that wasn't realistic, because these kinds of things are so much bigger than just a few individual people, and they do require so many stakeholders. And
Yeah.
uh so yeah.
Yeah, that's why there are some big things that happen when, our protagonists are not available to interact with them. It's like other people weren't going to sit around and wait for you. They went and did their
Yeah.
thing because they're protagonists in their own stories. And that
Um,
is one of the things that the books aren't long just because we wanted to put in lots of like, world building details and so forth, but because we did have the idea from the start that this needed to be the story of a bunch of different people all doing their own things. And then there are significant characters who don't get point of view. Because one of the ways you make a book shorter is you make it all revolve around your protagonist. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted it to be something where there are important other people who are driving other corners of the plot. And, putting that in takes more words.
yeah. And I will say also, one of the reasons we made a gesture towards what's going to happen in the future rather than getting into it is because we have learned from LARPs that we have run that constitutional conventions are never fun. Nobody likes them, because we've tried to run a few constitutional conventions and they're never fun and nobody likes them. So
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
didn't
So
want to
getting
do
more.
that.
Yeah, getting more into the weeds of how did the political agreements get formed. We're like, you know what? That stuff that's being done by people who are not our viewpoint characters anyway, So we're
Yeah.
just going to say this has happened, and now people are, arguing over or reacting to it. And frankly, one of the challenges we had with this book is that we did have a bunch of different plot lines going on, and we were sitting there trying to like Tetris them all and go, okay, what's the order in which these need to be resolved? Which things
Yeah.
are like going to happen earlier? Which things are going to happen later? And so, with dealing with the political stuff, that is one of the final bits that plays out. Because number one, we felt it was very central to the story in a this affects everybody and not just like one character. And also because then you're close to the end of the book and you don't want to then start filling it up with, and now people will sit down and argue. Like that's not the exciting part. So
Yeah.
putting it close to the end of the book means you can kind of just go, and then this thing has happened, and moving along to the explosions.
Although I have to be honest, for me personally, it also served very well as a distraction because I was like, oh, okay, so the magical plot is now over, right?
Yes.
Makes sense that there's still so much of the book left because there's this whole revolution still going on.
Yep.
No.
Yep.
And that was one of the things we discussed, because we were like, they're not, because of the magical part, they're not going to be able to succeed until that gets dealt with. Yeah.
Yes, there was a lot of time spent rearranging index cards on Alyssa's living room floor as we tried to go, okay, what if we do this before that?
And Thrace helped my cat.
Yes. Yes, he sat on chapter 23.
So I think we're gonna end this here. As I said, I absolutely love and adore them. I have now not had a favorite series for 2 years, I think, because my nostalgia favorite series from my teen years, I kind of reread and realized, well, I still love it because I'm still attached to it, but it's not quite holding up.
Yeah.
And there was just no series that kind of hit that spot for me, but this one definitely managed. So yeah, thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for
for having us and for talking it up to people, because word of mouth is genuinely one of the strongest drivers of book sales. Like, it is way above all the advertising and such that you think of. No, it's people recommending a book because they loved it. So
yeah, and I'm definitely trying to push it on to more people. But yeah, thank you for coming, and all your links where people can find you. Twitter, there's the Discord, right?
Yep.
If people have already read the series or haven't read the series, then I think you're on Mastodon, you said, also.
And on Blue Sky, I will send you infinite links.
Please, thank you. Also the website, because there's tons of information there, and also all the short stories, or almost all the short stories, the ones that are published online, at least. I think that was everything. Also my links obviously will also down below. There's going to be a lot of links beneath this video, so and yeah, so I think I'm probably gonna just film an outro afterwards. And so we're gonna say goodbye now to the viewers, and I'm gonna stop the recording. Or is there any last words that you want to say or share?
Just thank you, everybody, for all your support, and thank you, Sarah.
Yes.
Let me just jump on very quickly here again to do my ending spiel. As always, if you have any comments, any thoughts you want to share, leave them in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Definitely think about picking up the Rook and Rose series, because I think I was very bad at hiding it. It is an amazing series. And yeah, all the links to my social media, all the links to M.A. Carrick's stuff, the Kickstarter, the Snappy Dragon video on clothing in the Rook and Rose series, as well as my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries. That's all about reading adult high fantasy written by women and genderqueer folks. All of that will be left linked down below. And so with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!